His voice rose higher than it should have. The kind of sharp, cracking tone that doesn't command respect. It begs for control. Charlie Kirk's face flushed crimson under the studio lights, the smirk that usually held his confidence slipping into something jagged, something raw. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing a mask shatter in real time. "This is ridiculous!" Kirk barked, jabbing the air with his finger as if the sheer force of his indignation might erase what had just been said. But the words were already out there. They hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. And the one who had lit the match, Jasmine Crockett, sat perfectly composed, her eyes locked on him, steady as stone. The crowd could feel it, the imbalance of power shifting before their eyes. Kirk, long celebrated as the fiery architect of Turning Point's youth empire, was unraveling. His voice cracked again, the sound no longer defiant but desperate. Viewers at home, thousands of them, began typing furiously into their feeds. Tweets, clips, hashtags, the viral machinery was already roaring to life. And then the freeze-frame moment. His fist clenched, his jaw tight, the microphone trembling in his hand. The narrator's voice cuts in, cool and measured against the chaos. This was the moment Charlie Kirk's empire cracked under the weight of its own secrets. The image burns in. Crockett, still silent, her restraint louder than any of his outbursts. Kirk, caught between bluster and collapse, blinking too fast, speaking too quickly. The theater of arrogance reduced to panic in front of a nation. And yet, this was not where the story began. The fireworks you just witnessed were only the climax of a storm that had been gathering for years. To understand why one calm woman could so effortlessly dismantle the empire of a man who had built his career on shouting others down, we need to step back. Step back to the empire Kirk built. Step back to the secrets he tried to hide. Step back to the woman who arrived prepared to expose him. Because what happened in that room didn't just silence one man. It cracked open an entire narrative. But to understand why the room exploded, we have to go back to the beginning. The cameras were everywhere. Not just one live stream, not just a local feed. This was a nationally broadcasted showdown, beamed across platforms where millions of eyes, progressive and conservative alike, were locked in. The stakes weren't just about two people debating on a stage. They were about who gets to shape the story of America's future. Charlie Kirk knew that. He had built his persona on these stages, branding himself as the sharp-tongued general of youth conservatism. To his fans, he was the defender of tradition, the self-anointed warrior who could dismantle wokeness with a smirk and a one-liner. He thrived on the performance, the laughter of his base when he mocked an opponent, the clipped sound bites that ricocheted across conservative media. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another opponent to bulldoze with swagger. She came armed not with quips, but with a different kind of power, the power of patience, of truth, of preparation. In an era where shouting often drowns out substance, Crockett's calm presence was a weapon of its own. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. And in that calm, she carried something Kirk had spent his career avoiding: accountability. That's what made this night different. The crowd wasn't just there for entertainment. They were there for answers, and some suspected there were questions Kirk could not afford to answer. Because behind the polished branding of Turning Point lay shadows. There had always been whispers, lavish conferences with ballooning budgets, luxury retreats marketed as student training, donors whose names never surfaced in public records, but whose influence was written into every contract and event. It was an empire dressed in red, white, and blue, but financed in ways that few ever dared to scrutinize too closely. And Crockett? She had done her homework. She knew that Kirk's greatest weapon, his bravado, could become his greatest weakness if pressed against hard, undeniable facts. She wasn't here to trade insults. She was here to hold up a mirror and to make him squirm beneath his own reflection. That tension, the possibility of collapse, hung over the room like a storm cloud. Every audience member could feel it, even if they couldn't name it yet. Why was Kirk so quick to interrupt? Why was his laugh a little too sharp, his comebacks a little too forced? Beneath the confident veneer, he seemed nervous. And in politics, nerves often mean there's something to hide. This wasn't just about ideology anymore. It wasn't even just about winning a debate. It was about credibility, about who the audience would trust when the dust settled. Was Kirk truly the voice of a new conservative generation? Or was he the front man for a machine greased with money and power he didn't want exposed? The stakes were bigger than him. They were bigger than Crockett. They were about what happens when the forces of arrogance collide with the forces of accountability, and which side the American public chooses to believe. And as Kirk grew more defensive, his empire suddenly looked fragile. Because when a man who built his career shouting down opponents starts to sound rattled, it's a sign that something is coming, something he cannot control. The whispers were about to become revelations. The smirk was about to become a grimace. And when Jasmine Crockett stepped to the mic, the entire facade was about to crumble. Charlie Kirk did not stumble into the spotlight. He manufactured it. From his earliest days, he carried himself as though destiny had chosen him to lead a movement. He was still in his teens when he founded Turning Point USA, a student organization he branded as a crusade against liberal dominance on college campuses. The pitch was simple, the kind that lured donors hungry for a youthful champion. A young man standing boldly against the tide of progressive culture. It was a story made for cameras, and Kirk leaned into it with every fiber of his being. He wore the title of culture warrior like a crown. His boyish face transformed into a mask of certainty as he sparred with professors and heckled the libs. Conservative media crowned him as the next great voice of the movement. To his fans, he was a prodigy. To his critics, he was a provocateur who mistook volume for vision. But the truth was always more complicated. Behind the applause and the Instagram clips, behind the endless college speaking tours and the hashtags, lay a man obsessed with control. He wasn't just selling ideas. He was selling a brand, one polished with glossy conferences, celebrity guest speakers, and high-end production values that looked more like a Las Vegas spectacle than a student organization. The money flowed in. Wealthy donors, eager to shape the minds of America's youth, opened their checkbooks. Millions turned into tens of millions. Turning Point wasn't just an activist group anymore. It became an empire. And with empires come palaces, lavish retreats, sprawling conventions, and salaries that made critics wonder whether this was about grassroots empowerment or personal enrichment. Questions surfaced. Where exactly was the money going? Why did so much of the organization's budget vanish into administrative expenses? Why were there whispers about luxury accommodations for staff, five-star hotels, and endless perks? Whenever the spotlight turned toward the finances, Kirk shifted. He dodged. He attacked the questioner. He never gave a straight answer. That was the paradox of Charlie Kirk. On stage, he was loud, smug, untouchable. He mocked opponents with the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight in front of his fans. He relished in the spectacle, treating every debate like a prize fight he had already won. And yet, when pressed with facts, when the questions drifted too close to his empire's foundations, cracks appeared. His tone tightened. His eyes darted. His smug grin faltered. For years, that fragility remained hidden beneath layers of performance. His empire was big enough, his stage bright enough to drown out dissenting voices. The conservative media machine propped him up, and the donors kept the checks coming. To many, he looked invincible, the golden boy of a movement always eager to anoint the next savior. But the arrogance grew with the empire. He began to believe his own myth, strutting across stages with the air of inevitability, dismissing critics not just as wrong, but as beneath him. His words sharpened into insults. His tone swelled with condescension. Every smirk, every scoff, every raised eyebrow was a reminder that Charlie Kirk thought he was untouchable. And maybe he was, until the wrong opponent entered the frame. Because arrogance, for all its bluster, is brittle. It doesn't bend, it breaks. It thrives on applause but withers under silence. And when arrogance is finally met with truth, it rarely goes quietly. Charlie Kirk had built an empire on bravado. But empires built on bravado have fault lines. And in that brightly lit studio, with millions watching and history waiting to be written, those fault lines were about to crack open in spectacular fashion. He had risen on swagger, on the illusion of invulnerability. But what happens when someone walks in with the receipts, the facts, the calm voice of accountability that cannot be mocked away? That was the question hanging in the air, invisible but undeniable. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were about to see the answer. Because Charlie Kirk, the self-styled general of a movement, was about to meet his reckoning. But arrogance has a way of meeting its match. Before the cameras, before Congress, before the moment she locked eyes with Charlie Kirk across a stage trembling with tension, Jasmine Crockett was a young black woman in Texas, trying to carve out a place in a system that wasn't built to welcome her. She didn't grow up with the silver spoons or donor-backed safety nets that cushioned men like Kirk. She grew up with grit, with the knowledge that every step she took had to be earned twice over, once for herself, and once to prove to others that she belonged in rooms where her presence alone was treated as defiance. Her path began not in the glare of spotlights, but in classrooms and courtrooms. Law school was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. She chose the law not because it promised wealth, but because it offered a weapon, the power to defend those who had no voice. Long hours in libraries, late nights balancing jobs and study, endless sacrifices that stripped her days bare of comfort. These were the bricks of her foundation. When she finally became an attorney, Crockett didn't seek out plush corporate offices or cushy firm salaries. She went where the struggle was raw, where people couldn't afford champions, where families faced eviction notices and unjust charges, where the system assumed silence because it assumed no one would fight back. She became the advocate they hadn't expected but desperately needed. And with every case, her steel was forged. Courtrooms can be hostile places for a young black woman with fire in her eyes and truth in her mouth, but Crockett learned not to flinch. Judges glared, opponents sneered, but she stood unshaken. She knew that composure was its own form of resistance, that staying calm while others tried to rattle her was sometimes the sharpest blade she could wield. That same composure carried her into politics. Running for office meant more late nights, more doors slammed, more questions about whether someone like her could really win. But she did. She became a state legislator, then a congresswoman, carrying with her the same principles she had in court. Speak for the voiceless, stand for the truth, and never confuse arrogance with strength. And it is here, in this contrast, that the story of Jasmine Crockett collides with Charlie Kirk's. Where he flaunted his privilege, she wore her scars with pride. Where he raised his voice to dominate, she lowered hers to command attention. Where he relied on donors and stagecraft, she relied on receipts, hard evidence, airtight preparation, the kind that could slice through bravado like glass. To Kirk, debates were theater. To Crockett, debates were extensions of her life's work, the pursuit of accountability. He entered the stage expecting another sparring partner to mock and dismiss. She entered the stage as a lawyer with a case file she was ready to argue before the American public, and she knew what was in that file. She knew about the whispers, the inconsistencies, the numbers that didn't add up in Turning Point's books. She had traced the threads, the lavish spending, the luxury events, the shadow donors hiding behind patriotic slogans. She had come not just with arguments, but with facts so sharp they could cut through even Kirk's loudest interruptions. That was her brilliance. Crockett didn't need to match his volume or his ego. She only needed to remain steady, calm, patient. Because the louder Kirk shouted, the more fragile he appeared next to her silence. And when she finally chose to speak, the words would carry more weight than all his bluster combined. Her journey to that moment was not just about politics. It was about dignity. It was about showing every immigrant kid, every working-class dreamer, every young person told they were too different, or too loud, or not enough, that they could step into the fire and not be consumed. And so, on that night, as the cameras blinked red and the microphones buzzed with anticipation, Jasmine Crockett embodied more than herself. She embodied resilience. She embodied truth. She embodied the America that Kirk's arrogance could never quite drown out. The contrast could not have been sharper. Kirk with his empire built on spectacle and Crockett with her presence built on sacrifice. Kirk with his smirk and Crockett with her stillness. Kirk with his evasions and Crockett with her evidence. Every ounce of her journey had prepared her for this. The law, the activism, the nights spent standing firm in hostile courtrooms, the campaigns where she refused to yield to doubt. All of it had been leading here. And when she finally faced Kirk live, the silence before her words felt electric. The lights glared hotter now, as though they too felt the tension in the room. The stage was no longer a space for polite exchange. It had become an arena, each word a weapon, each silence a threat. Charlie Kirk leaned forward in his chair, lips curled into a smirk. "Here we go again," he sneered, wagging a finger toward Crockett as if she were an unruly student. The crowd chuckled, but not with the conviction he expected. It was a nervous laughter, thin and unsure, as though they could already sense he was pressing too hard. Crockett didn't flinch. Her hands rested calmly on the table, her eyes steady, unblinking. She let the smirk hang in the air, let the audience sit with its hollowness. That silence, more than any retort, unsettled Kirk. He shifted in his seat, eager to fill the void. "You see, folks," he said, turning toward the crowd, "this is what happens when Democrats run out of ideas. They sit there waiting for the moment to play the victim card." His voice rose, sharper now, desperate to draw laughter that never quite came. A few claps echoed, but they died quickly, swallowed by the heaviness of the room. Crockett's eyes never left him. She had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest strike is patience, that arrogance always rushes itself into a stumble. And stumble he did. Kirk interrupted her the moment she opened her mouth. "Oh, come on, Congresswoman, don't give us the lecture." But she stopped speaking, folded her hands, and simply looked at him. The audience, weary of his interruptions, began to turn. The same silence that had rattled judges in courtrooms was now rattling Kirk on a stage he thought he owned. The moderator tried to intervene, but Kirk barreled on, his words tumbling faster, his smile harder, his tone cracking at the edges. "These are just baseless attacks," he barked, "and the only reason she's here is to smear good people, people who actually care about America." The phrase hung awkwardly, his conviction weaker than his volume. The crowd murmured. Some nodded, but others whispered to each other, sensing that beneath his bombast was something brittle. Crockett finally leaned toward her mic. Her voice was low, calm, measured. "Charlie," she said, pausing just long enough for the audience to lean in, "are you sure you want to go down that road?" The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled across the room. For the first time, Kirk hesitated. His smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing, as though he'd glimpsed a danger he hadn't accounted for. The tension thickened. Every camera zoomed closer. Every viewer watching from home could feel the storm building. Kirk tried to recover, chuckling awkwardly, waving his hand as if to dismiss her. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "Don't act like you've got something special. We all know the script here." But the crowd didn't laugh. They were waiting, sensing that Crockett had indeed brought something more than words. She sat upright now, her composure unshaken, her presence expanding with every second Kirk flailed. He tried again, louder this time, hammering on about patriotism and loyalty, his voice rising to the point of strain. The desperation was obvious. Every interruption, every deflection was another stone in the wall he was building around himself. But Crockett had already found the cracks, and as the noise reached its peak, she calmly reached into her folder. The motion was small, almost imperceptible at first, but as her hand slid across the papers, as the manila edge flashed under the lights, the room shifted. The chuckles stopped. The murmurs silenced. Even Kirk froze mid-sentence, his words cut off by the weight of what he saw in her hands. The audience held its breath. They didn't know what was inside that folder, but they knew it mattered. They knew it carried the kind of power Kirk couldn't laugh away. Then Crockett reached into her folder, and history froze. The folder opened with the faintest snap, a sound so small yet deafening in its implication. The audience leaned forward instinctively, as though a single sheet of paper might change the air they were breathing. Charlie Kirk's eyes darted from the manila edge to Crockett's face, searching for reassurance that it was nothing, just theater, just a bluff. But there was no reassurance in her eyes, only calm, steady resolve. She lifted the first page and held it lightly, as though its weight didn't need to be forced. It spoke for itself. "Mr. Kirk," she began, her voice smooth, unhurried, "you've been rather proud of your organization's success. But success leaves a trail." The words sliced through the silence. She glanced down at the page, then back at him. "According to your own filings, Turning Point spent over 6 figures last year on what it listed as hospitality and travel." A ripple moved through the audience. Kirk's smirk twitched, his lips pressing together as though to choke back an instinctive retort. That's standard for a national organization," he stammered, his voice breaking on the word standard. Crockett didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned to the next page. "And yet these receipts don't read like student activism. They read like 5-star resorts. They read like catered dinners and luxury transportation, all under the banner of youth empowerment." The crowd gasped. Someone in the front row whispered, "Oh my God," as though the evidence had already convicted him. Kirk lunged for control. "That's misleading. Completely misleading," You don't understand how these things work. His voice cracked again, louder this time, trying to drown her out. But Crockett waited. The silence between his shouts gave her more power than his words ever could. When the noise finally thinned, she leaned into the mic again. "What I understand," she said softly, "is that when you're raising money from families who think they're funding grassroots activism, they're not expecting their donations to pay for steak dinners and beachfront hotels." The audience erupted. Applause, gasps, even a few boos directed at Kirk. Online, the live stream chat exploded. A truth of power, she brought the receipts. "Jen's progress, he's done. Look at his face, OMG, a Patriot watch. So this is where the money goes." Unbelievable. Kirk waved his hands frantically. "This is nonsense, smear tactics." "Everyone knows the left does this too. Why don't you talk about them?" But his words tumbled over themselves, the desperation unmistakable. His once polished rhythm had unraveled into stammers and half-thoughts. His face glowed red under the lights, the sweat at his temple betraying him. Crockett's composure never shifted. She reached calmly for the next sheet. "And then," she said, her tone tightening just slightly, "there are the donors, hidden behind shell organizations, unnamed, untraceable. Money funneled through dark corners into a group that claims to stand for transparency and freedom." The room went still. Even the moderator stopped breathing. Kirk slammed his palm on the table. "That's a lie. You can't prove that!" Crockett looked at him, then at the paper in her hand. "Actually, Charlie, that's exactly what this proves." She held up the document just high enough for the cameras to catch. The live stream chat went nuclear. "Justice for all." I'm screaming. She's fearless. "A Latina strong. This is why we stand Crockett." Calm, collected, dropping bombs. "Political junkie 89. Kirk's face looks like it's about to implode." The crowd broke into applause that rolled across the stage like thunder. Kirk tried to shout over it, but his voice dissolved into the roar. His body leaned forward, desperate, but the audience wasn't leaning with him anymore. They were leaning toward her. And Crockett wasn't done. She placed the stack of papers gently on the desk as if to say she could go all night, that the receipts were endless. Then she looked him in the eye, her voice quiet enough to draw everyone back into a hush. "Charlie, this isn't about me. It isn't even about you. It's about the students and families who believed in your cause. They thought they were investing in a movement. What they got was your lifestyle." Gasps again, louder this time. A few people stood, clapping, the electricity in the room undeniable. Kirk sputtered. That's not true. You're twisting everything." But the cracks had spread too far. His confidence was no longer broken in moments. It was broken in every breath. Crockett let the reaction simmer, then delivered the final blow. Her eyes locked on him, her voice firm but still calm, as though she were cross-examining a witness who had already lost. "You built an empire on patriotism, but you funded it with hypocrisy. And tonight everyone sees it." The words landed like a gavel. The audience roared. The live stream comments scrolled at dizzying speed. The narrative cemented itself in real time. Kirk's empire wasn't just being questioned. It was being exposed, unraveling piece by piece under the quiet force of one woman with evidence. Kirk slumped back in his chair, mumbling fragments, shaking his head as though denial could rewrite the papers still spread on the table. But no one was looking at him anymore. Their eyes were on Crockett. Their trust was in her composure, her receipts, her truth. And as she closed the folder, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of a reputation collapsing. The fallout wasn't just in that room, it went viral across the country. The moment Jasmine Crockett closed her folder, the internet opened its floodgates. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. The first 30 seconds of Kirk's meltdown hit timelines like lightning, his voice cracking, his face turning red. His frantic gestures as Crockett calmly laid down the receipts. Hashtags exploded across the digital sky. Kirk meltdown, receipts don't lie, Crockett crushes. On TikTok, teenagers stitched the clip with songs, slow zooms, and captions like, "When you realize your empire just got repossessed." Twitter turned his trembling fist into a meme, plastered with captions like, "When the waiter brings the bill you weren't ready for." But beyond the laughter, there was electricity. Viewers weren't just entertained. They felt vindicated. For every progressive who had grown weary of arrogance hiding behind patriotic slogans, this moment was proof. The truth still had power. Late-night comedy shows pounced immediately. One host quipped, "Charlie Kirk said Turning Point USA was about students. Turns out it was about student-sized portions of lobster at a five-star resort." The audience howled, but beneath the laughter was recognition. This wasn't just a roast. It was accountability being served on national television. Meanwhile, donors to Kirk's organization whispered behind closed doors. Phone calls were made in hushed tones. What if she was right? What if the money trail isn't as clean as we've been told? A few even leaked their concerns to reporters, the first cracks in a dam that had long held steady under Kirk's bravado. Conservative commentators split down the middle. Some doubled down, rushing to Kirk's defense, calling Crockett a grandstander and dismissing the receipts as selective. But even in their voices, there was hesitation. Others, the more cautious ones, stayed silent, waiting to see if the story had legs. And it did, because silence never stops a narrative already in motion. For Crockett's supporters, the eruption felt like oxygen. Social media feeds glowed with celebration. Dreamers rise. She didn't just debate. She destroyed, calm, factual, unshakable. Immigrants strong. For every one of us told to sit down and shut up, Crockett stood tall. Pride a justice forgins. I've never seen Kirk sweat like that. Pure gold. The validation pulsed beyond screens. College students replayed the clip in dorm rooms, laughing and cheering. Parents shared it with their kids, pointing to Crockett as an example of dignity under fire. It wasn't just viral entertainment, it was a cultural event, the kind that shapes identity and memory. And Kirk? His attempts at damage control only fueled the flames. He went live the next morning, ranting about fake news and manufactured outrage. But every denial was instantly clipped, mocked, and stitched beside Crockett's calm dismantling. His words sounded shrill next to her composure, like a man arguing with history itself. The ripple effect widened. Progressive groups fundraised off the moment. Their donation links captioned, "Support leaders who bring receipts." Student activists held watch parties, replaying Crockett's lines as though they were rally chants. Even neutral observers admitted what they saw, arrogance collapsing in real time, because that's what the internet had crystallized, the contrast. Kirk, red-faced, shouting, flailing. Crockett, composed, steady, armed with proof. It wasn't just politics. It was a morality play, acted out in front of millions. And everyone knew who the hero was. You could feel it in the comments, in the memes, in the laughter that spread across living rooms and feeds. You weren't the only one who saw it. The whole country was watching. The whole country felt the shift. And yet as the dust settled, a deeper truth about America was revealed. When the dust of laughter, outrage, and memes began to settle, what remained was more than a viral clip. It was a truth laid bare, an undeniable reminder that leadership isn't about who can shout the loudest or who can gather the flashiest stage, but about who can stand unshaken when challenged with facts. Jasmine Crockett's calm dismantling of Charlie Kirk's empire wasn't just about receipts or line items on a spreadsheet. It was about something bigger, something that cuts to the core of what America claims to be. Transparency versus corruption. Service versus self-interest, dignity versus arrogance. For years, Kirk had built his brand on noise, on swagger, on the idea that power belonged to whoever could dominate the stage. But Crockett showed that there is another kind of power, quiet, disciplined, rooted in truth, that doesn't need volume to make itself heard. Her composure was itself a message. Real strength doesn't flail, it doesn't sneer, it doesn't hide behind bluster. Real strength stands tall, even under fire. And in that moment, America saw the clash for what it was. Not just a debate between two figures, but a mirror reflecting who we are and who we want to be. Do we want leaders who treat our institutions like personal piggy banks, hiding behind slogans while pocketing the spoils? Or do we want leaders who bring the receipts, who hold power accountable, who remind us that public service is just that, service? The stakes stretch far beyond one man or one organization, because when accountability falls, corruption spreads. When arrogance goes unchecked, communities suffer. But when truth is spoken, calmly, firmly, without apology, it doesn't just win arguments. It wins hearts. It restores faith. It makes people believe again that dignity is not weakness, that justice is not naive, that Americanness itself means holding ourselves to the ideals we claim. The ripple of that night wasn't just digital, it was generational. Young viewers watching Crockett's poise saw a new model of leadership. Immigrant families saw validation, proof that their values, hard work, honesty, sacrifice, could stand tall against arrogance draped in a flag. And ordinary citizens, long tired of corruption dressed up as patriotism, saw hope that the truth still matters. That is the lesson Kirk never understood. Power without principle crumbles, but dignity, carried with patience and clarity, endures. Crockett didn't just win a moment. She reminded America that democracy, fragile as it is, still has defenders who cannot be rattled by arrogance, no matter how loud. And that brings us here to the part that matters most. Because this story isn't only about Charlie Kirk or Jasmine Crockett. It's about all of us, about the kind of country we allow to exist, about the leaders we choose to elevate, about the truths we demand to be told. Because in the end, truth doesn't just win arguments, it wins hearts, it wins communities, it wins the future. And this is where you come in. So there it was, the night Charlie Kirk lost his cool, and Jasmine Crockett proved that calm truth cuts deeper than all the bluster in the world. What began as a spectacle of arrogance ended as a lesson in dignity, service, and unshakable composure. Kirk's meltdown wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was the unraveling of a facade, the kind of moment that exposes what's hollow and what's real. And Crockett? She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need theatrics. With nothing more than patience, proof, and conviction, she reminded us all that leadership is about service, not selfishness. That accountability matters more than applause. That the true measure of power is the ability to stand in truth, even when facing arrogance at full volume. The story you just watched isn't only about one debate. It's about the kind of America we choose to build. One where hate and corruption are called out for what they are. One where dignity outlasts noise. One where truth doesn't just survive, it wins. And now the next step is yours. If this moment inspired you, if you believe dignity deserves a louder voice than arrogance, then be part of the movement. Subscribe to this channel, share this story with friends, and add your voice to the fight for truth and accountability. Because together we're not just spectators, we're participants. Every share, every comment, every conversation ripples outward, building a culture that refuses to let lies stand unchallenged. So join us, be part of something bigger. Because in the end, the fight isn't just about debates on a stage. It's about the values we carry, the truths we defend, and the future we shape together.